So over the summer, I took my daughter Eleanor to see the movie Inside Out 2. Perhaps some of you have seen this movie as well. But if you are not familiar with this Pixar franchise, it is a film centered around a girl named Riley. In the first movie, we meet Riley when she is 11 years old, and her family has just moved from Minnesota to San Francisco. And Riley, understandably, has lots of feelings about this move. But instead of the usual way feelings are expressed in a movie, in the Inside Out movies, they depict each of Riley's emotions as different characters that live inside her mind. For example, anger is a short man who shouts all the time and is colored red. And there is another character who is green. She constantly rolls her eyes, sounds a noise, says, "Ugh," and she is disgust. Throughout the movie, the characters fight for control over the console, which determines how Riley is feeling. In Inside Out 2, Riley is now 13 and at the early stages of puberty. She is about to start a new school and is experiencing new and complex emotions that she is finding it hard to understand. She is introduced to new feelings like ennui and envy. And like many teens and some adults too, much of the second movie is a fight for control over Riley's emotions, a fight that is primarily between joy and anxiety. Throughout the movie, Riley wants to feel joy, but more and more it seems like anxiety is taking over. And with so much anxiousness in Riley's life, it feels like there's little room for any other emotion. But throughout the movie, I found myself rooting for the brightly colored joy. She is a character that I can relate to. I understood these sometimes overly optimistic and sometimes irritatingly perky qualities in this character. And if you have ever seen a character on film that you can relate to so closely, it can be an unnerving experience. But what struck me most about Inside Out 2 was a moment towards the end of the film. At this point, anxiety has almost completely taken over. And Joy looks up at anger and disgust and fear with tears in her eyes. And she says in a resigned voice, "Maybe this is what happens as you grow up. You just feel less joy." And I found this line to be both profound and heart-wrenching. And while I was contemplating this statement, my 11-year-old daughter, Eleanor, looked up at me with horror, and she asked me, "Is that really true?" And I had been asking myself that very same question. Is it true that as we grow up, we feel less joy and become more anxious? What happens to the joy that comes so easily to us as children? And is there anything we can do to change this? So in that moment, in trying to mask my own feelings and attempting to comfort Eleanor, I put my arm around her and said, "No, it's not true. Of course not. There's nothing to worry about." But since that afternoon in the movie theater, I have been thinking about this tension between anxiety and joy. The tension between anxiety and joy is familiar to us as Jews. Over and over again, we have been caught living in the space between anxiety and joy. While we immerse ourselves in the joy of living in a particular place and time, there's also an awareness and an anxiety of the potential harm that might come to us living openly as Jews. Jewish life in Spain had reached a high point in the 12th and 13th centuries, the time in which the great philosopher Maimonides lived. Jews were integrated into Spanish society and served in the highest levels of government and culture and commerce. Spanish Jews lived joyfully until the ugliness of anti-Semitism took over. In 1492, the entire Jewish community and possibly 100,000 people were shorn of their wealth and expelled from the country. In a single stroke, 1,500 years of Jewish life in Spain had ended. Similarly, beginning in the early 19th century, German Jews were assimilated into German society. They took on leading roles in commerce, in government, in academia, culture, and more. And we all know too well the horrific end to that story. But even in the direst of circumstances, Jews of the past still sought joy. They made art, they celebrated Jewish holidays, and they retained their connection to Judaism. As Jews, we have lived and thrived in this liminality, the space between anxiety and joy, for thousands of years. And hopefully someday soon, our anxiety will lessen permanently. But we know, unfortunately, this past year was not the time for that. After the High Holy Days last year, when so many of us were filled with joy and optimism and inspiration, we had gone through the intense emotions of Yom Kippur and experienced the joy of Sukkot and the beginning of Simchat Torah. But then October 7th struck, and suddenly we found ourselves in an unrecognizable situation. Israel was brutally attacked with thousands of people being injured and murdered and kidnapped. Like you, I greeted the news of the attacks with shock and horror and outrage. We couldn't understand a world in which this type of cruelty could occur. We tried to make sense what happened on both spiritual and practical levels. Like many of you, I was in disbelief and felt heartbroken. How could so many innocent lives be taken, especially from a music festival that was full of people working towards peace? In those dark times, I was deeply moved by the calls and texts I received from people of numerous faiths. Christians, Hindus, Muslims, and many others wanted to offer their support to us. And despite this terrible tragedy, while connecting with Israeli friends or family and regularly checking the news after October 7th, many of us resumed our relatively normal lives. But as the conflict wore on, polarizing posts filled with misinformation spread across social media. Many of you have spoken to me about uncomfortable conversations that you had with friends or acquaintances. Sometimes these interactions were so tense, they ended decades of friendship. As the writer Dara Horn explained in a recent Atlantic article, October 7th created a permission structure for anti-Semitism. The rapid rise in anti-Semitic incidents across the country and the protests on college campuses bear her point out. At many universities, Zionists had become an abusive synonym for Jew or Jewish students. Our children, our relatives, faced harassment in dining halls, in dormitories, and even in classrooms. And as our collective anxiety rose, it became harder and harder to focus on joy. So we sought to comprehend October 7th and the anti-Semitism that followed. But at that point, Jewish life here at IHC continued to grow and thrive. And in response to the events of last year, many people leaned further into their Judaism. Over their past year, participation in classes and Shabbat services and social justice activities have grown rapidly. IHC became a place to find comfort and connection and even joy. So as we navigate this tension between joy and anxiety on a global scale, unfortunately, many of us have to balance it on a personal life too. Last year, I shared with you that my husband, Luke, had undergone treatments for cancer, and we thought and we hoped that the cancer would be out of our lives. But unfortunately, we were not that lucky. And this year, Luke underwent a second round of chemotherapy. As Luke made his way through more infusion, the kindness and care that this community showed my family was deeply touching and greatly appreciated. And now, as we continue to navigate Luke's treatments, he is getting scanned every 9 weeks. So every 9 weeks as these scans approach, our anxieties rise, especially right after the scan, because Luke's doctor only calls when it is bad news. So we spend those days hoping and praying for the phone not to ring. The worst moments are when we are waiting for the doctor to share the results with us. In those moments, we sit in that awful peach-colored room with inspirational quotes on the wall. We are filled with fear. Yet, when we are lucky, there is good news and our anxiety recedes. In those moments, we can breathe again and we are filled with gratitude and relief. And I am sharing our experiences today because I know we are not the only ones living in fear or with anxieties. Too many of you have been in similar situations when you're waiting to hear about the results of a scan or a diagnosis for yourself or a loved one. Many of us also live with anxieties like job uncertainties or financial worries or ongoing mental health concerns and many, many other reasons. Simply put, there are too many sources of anxiety in our lives. And if you were lucky enough to have a year without worry, then that is awesome. Truly, it is something to be celebrated. And I hope that all of us, many of us, will have many, many more years like that. But we live in this space. We voice our anxiety, and Judaism helps bring us back to joy. When we have the difficult times, we hope the whole IHC wants IHC to be a place where we can come to share our worries and our heartaches and our concerns. It is our sacred goal, it is our shared goal to be a sacred place, a kahila kadosha, a sacred community where we can lift each other up, where we can support each other. The strength of a community can be a source of joy and comfort in anxious times and help us face whatever comes our way. So as we live our lives vacillating between anxiety and joy, we have to acknowledge that we have limited control over our lives. And this is exactly where the High Holy Day liturgy meets us. Prayers like the Unatana Tokef help us voice our deepest, scariest fears and anxieties. The prayer literally asks us questions that we can't or don't the rest of the year. It asks over and over again, who shall live and who shall die? When taken literally, the central primal question voices a question that keeps us up at night and frightens us to our very core. Will it be me? Will it be my loved one? And while there are beautiful metaphorical interpretations of this prayer, at the heart, the Unatana Tokef is asking us to look directly into our fears. But even as we face our fears head on, we also have to acknowledge that despite our technologies and despite all the attempts that we have to control our lives, there are still certain aspects that are beyond our control. And primarily among them, how long any of us will live. And the longer I am in this profession and the older I get, the less I understand why some people get to live long lives that seem blessed and others don't. The theology of why people suffer and others don't remains elusive and does not have any satisfactory answers. But we continue to seek these answers and face our fears and voice our anxieties. But the wisdom is Judaism is that the service does not end there. We don't recite the Unatana Tokef today and then go home. Instead, we turn to the Torah service and we recite some of my most favorite lines in the entire Torah. We say, Uvaharta Bahayim, which means choose life. Today, on this very same day when we face our fears, we are also asked to choose life, to celebrate life, and to live a good one. We are also reminded that Judaism is a religion that celebrates, appreciates, and seeks out joy. Joy has been deeply embedded into Judaism for thousands of years. In Talmudic times, around the 4th century, the rabbis urged us to say 100 blessings a day. They suggested that each and every day we find 100 things to appreciate, to be grateful for, that bring us joy. This does not assuage our anxieties or have us live in false positivity. Instead, what the suggestions of the rabbi does, it helps us counterbalance the heaviness that can feel like it is surrounding us. It helps us move through life looking for things to be grateful for and acknowledging our blessings. So we choose joy and we choose life over and over again. In Psalms 30, we read, "You have turned my mourning into dancing." I recently read a story about a cafe in Ramat Gan, a city in Israel, that is built around this metaphor. In this cafe, Cafe Europa, it became a place where Holocaust survivors could come and socialize and dine together, and most importantly, dance. The purpose of Cafe Europa was not for the survivors to share their stories, but instead to celebrate life. These people live through unthinkable horrors in their lives, but they choose to spend time in that space that is dedicated to joy, to love, and community. The founder of this cafe, Silva Lipka, called Cafe Europa an optimistic place where clients did not focus on the Holocaust, but instead came to be with their friends and dance. Cafe Europa literally turned mourning into dancing, into celebrating life, into joy, and encouraged people to come to gather and choose life over and over again. Uvaharta Bahayim, choose life. Today also encourages us to see our blessings and choose joy. Judaism gives us an opportunity to show up and create joy and dance every single week. And that is the true meaning of Shabbat. Shabbat is like a wedding each week between us and God. And even on those weeks, and especially on those hard weeks, we can still try to show up for ourselves and each other. Because when we do, we can feel connected to Judaism, to community, and to our blessings. Anxiety is real, and our society needs to take our mental health more seriously. But Judaism helps us seek out sparks of joy, hope, and optimism in our everyday lives. In the writings of Reb Nachman of Breslov, who founded the Breslov Hasidic movement in Eastern Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, makes this point clear. Much of Reb Nachman's work is combined mysticism and Torah to create spiritual practices and guides. And despite his very real struggles with depression, he searched for joy, writing these familiar words: "Know that every person has to cross a narrow bridge, and the most important part is not to be afraid." As Reb Nachman explained, the quest for joy is an important spiritual practice, vital to our well-being. And that is why he authored the following prayer: God, I stand beaten and battered by countless manifestations of my own inadequacies. Yet we must live with joy. We must overcome despair, seek, pursue, and find every inkling of goodness, every positive point within ourselves, and discover true joy. Aid me with this quest, O God. Help me find satisfaction and a deep abiding pleasure in all that I have, in all that I do, in all that I am. There are so many, too many reasons to be anxious, yet Judaism, the high holy days, and especially Yom Kippur, remind us not to allow anxieties to diminish the present moment or our joy. And yes, there are times when joy is the furthest thing from our minds, but today encourages us, when we can, to choose life, to choose blessings, to choose joy. As the movie Inside Out 2 concludes, Joy has learned to live with anxiety and appreciates how anxiety can be helpful. Joy makes anxiety a special chair. And in this chair, anxiety can be contained and quieted. Once anxiety settles into her chair, then joy resumes control over the console, taking charge of Riley's emotions once again. So too may it be for us. May we find a chair in our minds for our anxiety and allow space for joy in our lives. May 5785 be a year of blessings, goodness, love, community, and especially finding joy for all. Gamar Hatima Tova. May you all be sealed for good.